Thank you for joining me. Feminism, Comics and Humour, the 1980s. I'm going to start with this wonderful cartoon by American cartoonist M.K. Serwick, also known as Comic Nurse, that she drew in response to the points I made in my first introductory talk. If the 70s was the building of feminist ladders and early friendships and relationships, then the 80s saw these feminist ladders being lowered to bring others up. And we can start to trace friendships and relationship networks widening within feminism and comics. And it's this really important foundational structure that I hope is one of the things I can show in this talk. Well, MK's excellent graphic novel is taking turns, a documentation through her autobiographical lens of her experience of nursing at HIV/AIDS care unit in Chicago in '94. And hot off the press, or launching in August, is her edited collection of menopause comics, which I'm excited to have contributed to. I think myself and Rachel House are representative of British currently menopausal cartoonists. Is that right? From talking about the infusion of anger in the 1970s, there was a change in the 1980s. And this was the decade of contradictions. And as I've been preparing this talk, I've been realizing how particularly relevant this is to today's COVID-19 pandemic, when we don't know what we're being told or where we are. So for the 1980s, we can interpret this decade as one of advancement or diminishment, or rather confusingly, perhaps both. And I want to talk during this talk about the appearance of self-deprecation in some of the cartoons that I found, and talk through my interpretation of how and why I think humour changed to include this quality. And I'm going to start with the See Red Women's poster that I ended my last talk with, because it's such an obvious starting point for talking about this decade in Britain, with Conservative Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, the first woman Prime Minister and the longest serving in the 20th century. So I'm going to start this little bit, shaping this bit for people who may not know about Thatcherism. So if, like myself, you lived through this period, forgive me while I give a brief overview, and hope it doesn't bring back too many terrible memories of the devastation. So already there was a contradiction. The first woman prime minister in the UK could never have got to this position without feminist activity. But Thatcher's priority was the country's economic prosperity, and it was presented as something that would offer individual freedom. Thatcher's priority was never equality, which meant Thatcher's priority was never supportive of the feminist aims of equality for women. And yet, paradoxically, some aspects of feminism actually benefited under Thatcher. So why was this? We can refer to this economic prioritizing as neoliberalism. For example, in the poster, this £4 billion in public spending was driven by motivation to save money, an economic motivation, but the cuts were made in areas that indirectly had negative impact on low-income women. For example, cuts to daycare centres, cuts to nurseries that were closed, which meant that people on low income couldn't afford to pay for these services, and invariably the care fell to women, making them unable to do paid work. Also down here at the bottom, the selling of government housing directly impacted low income women with families, because affordable housing became less available. What was very clear, very clever about Thatcher was that she endorsed the feminine, not the feminist. And here in the poster, we can see clearly the photo of her looking to the audience in a pose that suggests care. It suggests she was an ordinary housewife. Scrawled on top is the See Red Women's workshop message, tough, the comment on her policies, which was what they were. So this ordinary woman presentation reinforced the Conservative Party's moral position, which promoted ideas of the traditional family, the ordinary housewife staying home as carer and domestic worker. And I just want to come in with a recommendation. I hope that some of you have enjoyed Mrs. America. And sorry, again, this is for people probably, it's restricted to the UK because it's a BBC drama. It's really worth watching. And I love the description by journalist Suzanne Moore, depicts one of feminism's toughest battles, the fight against female misogynists. So have a look at that. It's about feminism in America, but it's still relevant because it echoes Margaret Thatcher's approach. And we may refer to this moral element of Thatcherism as neoconservatism. In my 1970s talk, I talked about how the role of women in the home providing unpaid care and childcare and domestic work supported capitalism, supported a social system that prioritizes profit and the economy over the well-being of everyone. So it would make sense that this was used as a moral message of an economy-driven government. But this neoliberalism, this economic prioritizing, and the moral stance of neoconservatism opposed each other or contradicted each other sometimes, which appeared to support, in some cases, a feminist agenda. And one example of this is the Southall Black Sisters, which was established in '79 as a grassroots voluntary organization to meet the needs of Black, Asian, and African Caribbean women. This organization is still active today, highlighting and challenging domestic and gender-related violence against women. So this organization had the expertise to deliver services that the government was now obliged to provide, and it was cheaper for the government to pay an organization already delivering. So the priority from the government was economic, but at the same time, it supported feminist activity. It meant women activists were able to be paid for the work they'd been doing on a voluntary basis, and collectives began to organize themselves within government-funded centres. And we can refer to this as a municipal feminism. And it's an example, one example of how feminist activity was increasingly characterized by institutionalization and professionalization, both of which have worked to the benefit and to the detriment of women. One example of institutionalized feminism was the introduction of women's studies as a university subject. In 1980, the University of Kent in Canterbury introduced the first master's degree in women's studies. Again, there was something of a contradiction here because women's studies became increasingly popular as a subject as a result of responding to the market. But the concept of the market was previously dismissed as a tool of capitalism, but now was bringing beneficial results with these popular new courses. In turn, also, of course, adding a platform for institutionalized feminist activity. In my first talk, I mentioned that my own PhD was in gender studies, which was what women's studies later became. And as an aside, by the way, at the University of Sussex, where I did my PhD, there isn't a department or school of gender studies. So I did my gender studies in the School of Media and Film, which indicates that there's still some way to go in establishing feminism within academia. And again, the marketing process offered another new platform for women cartoonists to get paid for posters and publicity. This cartoon by Paula Ewens in 1987 appeared in Feminist Review and shows how academia may be considered detrimental as well as beneficial to women. The label on the folder tells us her research is motherhood, the female experience, but we can see straight away the irritation of the interviewer with the noisy baby. She wants the research to be conducted according to existing role models in academia, which of course is the masculine model, but of course also the noise is the female experience of motherhood. Paula Ewens is satirizing the distance between theory within the academy and the actual experience of women from which 1970s feminism had grown. And this distance was a distinctive feature of feminism, with the theoretical feminist debates and ideas not always consistent with the messiness, often chaotic and contradictory lived reality. And this cartoon also highlights a sense, whether real or imagined, of criticism between feminists, a kind of hierarchy. Here, perhaps the disapproval is from these newly professionalized feminists. There was a sense of a sort of policing emerging, an idea of being the right kind of feminist, and cartoons were an ideal way of addressing such tensions. The contradiction is also captured in a cartoon by Maggie Ling, originally drawn in '86 and appearing in the Independent in 1992. I surveyed the sexual permissiveness of the 60s and the flighty feminism of the 70s to become a born-again 80s feminist. I refused to swallow man-made pills, cast aside my mortal coil, took a deep breath, and said goodbye to the diaphragm. At last, I began to beat my own rhythm, not subject to any man's sexual whims. I had finally found myself. I was centered, my inner being calmed. And then we see in the final panel, then I fell in love. She is feminist, but in the final panel, she mocks herself and her own contradictory traditional notions of romantic love and family. She's inside the group, but at the same time outside, which we may refer to as abject. I'll come back to that. Maggie Ling is now a writer, and now I have to say I'm currently enjoying and recommend Appetite, her recent collection of short stories. Details on her website here. So what was happening in feminist theorizing in this decade? So it was during this decade that I was at the University of Sussex studying for a BA in social anthropology. And social anthropology at this time was challenging the idea that institutions, social institutions such as the family, the legal system, political system, marriage, challenging the ideas that these institutions are universally the same by looking globally with global comparisons. And a famous example is by Margaret Mead, who in 1928, her research in Samoa challenged the Western assumptions around adolescence. So it was 30 years later when I returned to Sussex to do my PhD, and my reading, including works for what is generally known as British Cultural Studies. And this came out of work being done at the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies, which was based at University of Birmingham, founded in '64 and continuing till 2002. And it produced a group of influential thinkers, some really relevant to feminism, and particularly important was Stuart Hall, one of the founding members. And here's another recommendation: if you get a chance to see the Stuart Hall Project, which is a film by British artist John Okomfora, it's a real insight into identity. And there were works coming out that contributed to British feminist thinking, including Hazel Carby's essay, which explored the contradiction of the white feminist theoretical claim to universal womanhood on the one hand, and the practice of excluding women who are different on the other. Black feminism was challenging feminist thinking as prioritizing differentiations around class and gender over race. And an important British feminist classic published in '85 was Beverly Bryan, Stella Dadsey and Suzanne Scaife reconstructing history through analysis to reclaim Black women's place in Britain. In America, activists Kimberlé Williams Crenshaw and Angela Davis were prominent in challenging ideas around race within feminism, and influential bestsellers in America at the time included Bell Hooks' Ain't I a Woman and Audre Lorde's Sister Outsider. Feminist theory was also being challenged as heterosexist, and in works such as American scholar Adrienne Riche's Compulsory Heterosexuality and Lesbian Existence. And in 1983, Spare Rib, as one of the main platforms for feminist debate in the UK, was criticised for the lack of difference and the lack of diversity in their organisation and editorial policy. And they responded by changing from an all-white collective to one which was half women of colour, as well as representing concerns of lesbians, working class and older women. And this cartoon by Val appeared in the issue that announced this decision. We can see the sailing boats representing some of the different strands of feminism. The visual message is of feminism being a rather rough sea and with rather insubstantial boats in these stormy conditions. We see the metaphorical use of the wave in the background, second wave, early second wave feminism with the middle class heterosexual and the lesbian feminist boats at the point of collision with Irish feminists. In the foreground, riding the crest of the wave, are working class dykes, sisters against disablement and women of colour, reflecting this prominent emphasis on difference in the 80s feminist debate, which was now directly impacting Spare Rib. And poor old Spare Rib, here we see at the bottom this empty, sunk boat without a sail and two smiling sharks circling it. The use of the knowing animal can be interpreted as an observational comment. It injects incongruity and offers distance from the question being asked, which was perhaps from a fraction within feminism that would actually be rather pleased to see Spare Rib go under. And the humour is this potential schadenfreude or superiority of an anti-feminist or shark's opinion. And here we see the call out for diversity. We're hoping to have a regular page of cartoons by women of colour especially invited to contribute, and a satirical cartoon by Michelle. Equal opportunities? Of course, dear, there are equal opportunities in this office. Oh yes, and we see the women in roles subservient to the white male boss and the cleaner as a black woman. And this cartoon by Tamsin satirises the tokenism, a criticism of feminism at the time. We'll have one black, disabled female presenter, and all the rest of the programme team can be normal. Interestingly, the cartoonists use their first names, and I was unable to trace Tamsin and Michelle. So if anyone knows who they were or where they are now, do get in touch with me. To turn to what was happening in the alternative comics that I talked about in the 1970s, in 1981, the first graphic novel to be published in the UK was True Love by Posy Simmonds, this wonderful satirical tragicomedy of unrequited heterosexual romance and satire of the social construction of romance itself. Is just a joy to read still. If you're not familiar with Posy Simmonds' work, this is her most recent graphic novel. And in 2019, she had a retrospective exhibition in London, accompanied by a book by Paul Gravett, who curated it. A shift had taken place in the so-called alternative comics in terms of the subject matter, with the autobiographical being introduced, already a subject area that was being embraced by feminists in prose form through feminist publishing. In 1988, Al Davison's The Spiral Cage was the first British graphic memoir to be published. A quick product placement here. My own book, 23 years later, was the first graphic memoir by a woman to be published in Britain. Raymond Briggs' graphic novel When the Wind Blows was about the effects of a nuclear war through the eyes of an elderly couple in rural England. And two other works to note, which were serialized works, later becoming graphic novels, were Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' Watchmen, forever challenging the position and understanding of the superhero, and also pushing how the comics form can be used, and Brian Talbot's apocalyptic The Adventures of Luther Arkwright. There was a focus on the serious, but also containing humour and satire. In feminist publishing, the splintering of feminist ideas was reflected in the proliferation of feminist magazines with differing emphasis. Most of the publications carried women's cartoons and comics. Shocking Pink Collective, and most of them were run still by collectives. Shocking Pink set up not quite a magazine, but not really a fanzine. A group of younger women that was supported and helped really through sharing of knowledge and office space by the Spare Rib Collective. So again, that connections and the relationships. Feminist Arts News had a different regional women's group edit and produce each edition with a theme for each issue. Number 3 was a special comics issue led by Manchester Art Group, Kath Pryor, Fanny Tribble, Ewa Zyborska and Fanny Ives. The London-based feminist newspaper group was Outright Women's Newspaper, focusing on oppression in the context of imperialism, racism and class divisions. Trouble and Strife was a radical feminist magazine, and Every Woman magazine was set up as the only current affairs magazine. In addition to feminist publishing was now hugely expanding and included cartoon books. Virago Press, which is the surviving one, founded by Carmen Carlil and joined by Marsha and Rosie Boycott, who had been the founders of Spare Rib, as directors a year later. The Women's Press and Sheba Feminist Press prioritized writing of ordinary, non-privileged woman in post-imperial Britain, set up specifically to be more diverse than the high modernist clique that controlled British publishing. The most important point to make is that by 1988, 11 publishing companies had set up, feminist publishing companies had set up in Britain, and 4 of those included women's cartoon books in their title lists, which meant more platforms for women cartoonists to get paid work and more audience or readership for the humour and feminist ideas in cartoon form. And this 1984 Women Draw is published cartoons by 66 women, a project initiated and coordinated by Women's Press art director Suzanne Perkins. And at this time, well, a little earlier, one of the collective members of the Women's Press was Ros Delanneral, and I was at school with her daughter Aisha Delanneral we've been friends since age 5. One of my oldest and dearest friends, she might even be here with us, now a practical philosopher working in the arts. And I quite liked this continuity, the legacy of the consciousness raising that Aisha is now using in her work. Here's a cartoon which I chose from the Women Draw book by Marion Lidbrook, because it just seems so relevant to today. All governments lie. I'm sick of it. Sick of lies. Trouble is, I'm also sick of the truth. And this burgeoning activity around feminist publishing was supported by feminist bookshops that were opening around the country. Sister Right was Britain's first feminist bookshop, opening in London in 1979. And during the 80s, 90s, 60 bookshops opened around the country. And I'm going to make this link from feminist bookshops to talk about Kath Tate. So the way I divided my research was to select case studies from individuals, collectives, and the protest. And I've chosen Kath Tate as a collective, and I'll talk a bit more about why. And I'm going to link it with the Silver Moon bookshop, because it was while Kath was delivering her postcards that she was producing to the bookshop and chatting to the women there, that she was first introduced to women cartoonists Kath Jackson, Kate Charlesworth, and Viv Quillen. And here's one of the, and then that set Kath on a road to publishing cartoons by women on postcards. So Kath Tate and Kath Tate Cards, as it became, wasn't a collective. Kath's an individual, but I was interested in presenting her business as a form of an updated collective that had necessarily adjusted to this growing neoliberalism, but at the same time maintained a feminist lens. So Kath is the director. It's run as a business, so profit-based, but she's always paid artists that she works with. She's always invited a collaborative participation and friendship. Her staff are still, the business still runs today, her staff are women, and she seems to prioritize their well-being. That's the impression I get. Also, the similarity was that her starting point was from political motivation. So this was her first postcard that she produced of her own work that is iconic, and she probably wouldn't have found a publisher for it elsewhere. So in a sense, she had to publish it, and it was hugely successful. I think the making of her first postcard is significant to these times because it was made at an adult education class, and adult education was one of the services that was cut towards the end of Thatcher's government. But it was something that particularly benefited women, particularly women who'd missed out on education or had children. Plus, it offered employment opportunities to practicing artists. In Kath's case, it facilitated her direct access to a leading British artist, Peter Kennard, who was her tutor. Kath started her business from her front room and shared childcare with her spouse to work on the postcards. Again, a similarity of building up as the original collectives of the 70s and 80s. And here's from, I think this is Angela Martin, but tell me if I'm wrong. I put him on white synthetics. Again, it seemed rather relevant to today from Kath's, some of the cards she produced. And I really enjoy this Ros Asquith one. Mummy found a condom on the patio. What's a patio? I also saw similarities in Kath's story to the suffragette strategy. She published feminist messages on postcards, which is what the suffragettes did from 1909 to World War I. Kath distributed through the feminist networks and radical bookshops, conferences, benefiting from this now established feminist structure. And of course, she used humour. Oh, product placement. And of course, this is the most important Inking Woman book that Kath was in a perfect position to co-edit with me, and that was nice to work on. So that's an illustrated history. The other collective, perhaps the most well-known of alternative women's comics, again, we might question whether it's an updated collective, was Sour Cream. Perhaps more accurately, we can call it a collection in the beginning. In 1979, 4 London-based women cartoonists, Christine Roche, Jo Nesbitt, Liz Mackey, and Leslie Ruder, produced and self-published Sour Cream #1, the first of a series of 5 British anthologies, unique as a series of British women's comics. The women had met through the women's movement and were working for publications such as Time Out and Spare Rib. They did consider approaching a publisher for this anthology, but decided they probably wouldn't get published, and that also they'd have more freedom self-publishing. And in communication with Christine Roche, She didn't define the group originally as a collective because there was no censure or democratic process over what they included in the first issue. It was rather a collection of the works of the four of them, which was a platform for them to visually express views they thought the publishers may not publish. So following number 1, the women placed an ad in Spare Rib to invite a wider group of women. And this was produced in 1981. It was published by Sheba Feminist Publishers in paperback format and included the work of 13 women cartoonists. I have chosen this cartoon by Liz Mackey from the first issue to talk about because it comments on the neoliberal idea of individualism through home ownership, which was promoted by Thatcher, reflected in the right to buy legislation for council house tenants, which was passed in the Housing Act 1980. The first tier symbolises a block of flats, high-rise flats, and the high-rise was celebrated by architects and subsidised by governments during the 60s and 70s as this perfect solution for the housing shortage, particularly for low-income families. But by the 70s, they were being recognised as fostering social isolation and crime, among other problems. And it's the social isolation that this cartoon highlights. The tower block is great because it functions as a comic page within a comic page. So the individual flat windows can be read as panels, and each one this repetitive, slightly different, but always the same, this cry of why can't I cope? The women in the roles of child carer. And then this is contrasted with this sign promoting self-contained capitalist development, living accommodation. And the first panel on the bottom section symbolises the adult education classroom. And we can see from the documents the teacher with the register and the student with the physics A level. The block and the clock and shading shows it's an evening class. And although it benefited Cath Tate, the idea of the evening class, and in theory it was aimed at women with children, to benefit women with small children, but the actual practice was for single parents and low-income mothers of very young children. The problem of childcare was overlooked. So this is the contradiction. The babies on the backs visually answered this question of who needs nurseries, which the need for nursery provision was one of the original demands of feminism. And the satire is immediate. If we look on the top right, the woman putting the meal for her husband reminds us that many women were still responsible within the family household, whether they worked outside or not. And finally, we see her expression resigned, visually answering his question. And this punchline of natural wastage is her own natural wastage, but it also refers to an employment term for the situation when employers who leave an organisation are not replaced. And the representation of women of colour began to become more visible from '83, as I talked about in the Spare Rib issue. And this is shown on the drawing of the front cover of the Sour Cream Special issue number 4 and 5 in '84. And this issue was funded by the Greater London Council, the GLC, and the Greater London Council Arts Association. And both these funding bodies supported diversity and difference in their decisions. The GLC was such an influential local government body, and between '82 and '86, when it was disbanded by the Conservative government, it contributed £4.5 million to women's projects. I want to talk about humour now. In my talk about the 70s, I argued feminist cartoons had a sense of anger, a laughing at men or a laughing at the system, which I interpreted as this reversal of the superiority theory. and also a reflection of the necessary anger of feminism during that decade. What I noticed happening in some of the cartoons was this self-deprecation, and it made me feel uncomfortable. What was going on that was making women put themselves down in this way in the jokes? Could I explain this change as women turning anger in on themselves, or was something else going on? And I came across this quotation: self-deprecation as comic strategy has been a cause of feminist unease. And I wondered if this feminist unease was what I was feeling. And I wanted to explore it a bit more, especially when I came across Regina Barreca's comment that this self-deprecation was the most traditional form of women's humour. She also talked about how this traditional domestic humour, in traditional domestic humour by women make fun of her home, her children, or her husband, and she suggests it's relying on a type of extended self-deprecation because she's responsible for them. So to kick her kids is to kick herself. So still, I guess my question was, is self-deprecation okay? And the question I started with, is it self-mockery or is it self-hate? And I wanted to give you an example of a cartoon to show what I mean by self-deprecating and talk through my thought process. In this cartoon by Barbary O'Brien in '93, so a bit later, now there's a reliable way to reduce visible signs of aging. Put a bag over your head. Okay, I get it, it's funny. You know, it speaks to me, and I certainly don't read it as self-hate. Is such humour feminine, feminist, or actually misogynist? So if we take this as self-hate, then we can interpret this cartoon as agreeing with or endorsing society's expectations. So in this case, we can read this cartoon as supporting society's ideas of female beauty, ideas which conflate women's beauty with youth. So what that means is the laughter is at the less powerful, the aging woman, or the woman whose looks don't conform to the ideal, if we interpret it in that way. Or if we interpret it as self-mockery, as a gentler form, a gentle satirizing of the status quo that's not so aggressive. And the purpose is different, which is to consolidate a group by nurturing empathy in a way that doesn't alienate the majority. In this case, the cartoon's playing to an in crowd, to a knowing audience that shares a value system, feminist value system, but also recognizes the human contradiction. So this gentle subversion. And if we agree with this interpretation, we can actually argue for the transformative potential in such deprecating humour. In this case, the feminist tension that I referred to earlier is explained. It's the conflict of being part of something and again being at the same time excluded from something else. The bag on the woman's head makes her a woman, but at the same time, not a woman. The sinister implication of the bag over the head is a symbolization of suffocation or self-annihilation of the abject woman. And it's this contradiction between the promise of something pleasurable to be beautiful according to social norms and something intolerable, which is, in this case, dead. So this invokes French feminist Julia Christopher's ideas around the abject that simultaneously beseeches and pulverizes the subject. The idea is that something's at the same time physically pleasurable, but also at the same time repulsive and intolerable. And if we apply this to our interpretation, we want to be physically beautiful, but at the same time to do so supports the patriarchal notions that's intolerable to our feminist value system. The idea of transformative potential makes sense to me at the time of conflicting ideas within feminism that we've seen in the Val cartoon, or the different fractions appearing within feminism and the contradictions within women's personal experience, such as in the Maggie Ling's cartoon. And I found this cartoon by Ruth Cohen with a comment by Fanny Tribble on the right really interesting. So it starts with bloody men, number 1. This may sound a bit funny, Jenny, but well, I feel kind of attracted to you, you know. Not that I want anything or anything. I don't want you to feel any pressure or anything. And I know I hardly know you, but maybe we could see more of each other. And Jenny blushes, number 2. Hey, Sue, that's okay. I think it's just great that you feel you can express those feelings to me. I don't feel pressurized at all. I know we hardly know each other, but that's okay. Then number 3, another day. Exactly the same text to her, but this time from a man. And Jenny's response is, fuck off. And on the side is Fanny's comment, Fanny Tribble's comment about this. This cartoon is taken from a pamphlet called Maelstrom, brought out by the 2 women, Ruth Cohen and Ros Keane. I like the cartoons, of which this is just one, because not only are they more readable than the written text, but also because they dare to criticize women and the women's lib movement, something which us feminist cartoonists are often censored from doing by feminist type publications. And I found that interesting because my assertion is that actually feminist cartooning could question rather successfully. It was a platform where questioning could take place. And so it's interesting to me that Fanny felt this sense of policing. And by the way, I think in this cartoon, she is doing just that, of questioning and criticizing in a gentle way. But it was not just in feminism that there were tensions and unease, and self-deprecation was being used within humour more widely. Last time I talked about how mainstream comedy in the 70s, live comedy, was performed at working men's clubs in the north of England and relied completely on negative stereotypes, on sexism, racism and homophobia for laughs, with very few women included in the programming. And this was the only mainstream live comedy in Britain at the time. In 1979 to 1988, what we now know of as the alternative comedy movement take place, which transformed British comedy, transformed how we understand British humour. In 1979, the Comedy Store in Soho opened, hosting these comedy nights, and the comedy was improvised. There were no scripts, and it was the stark opposite of traditional mainstream humour at the time. It was politically left-wing, observational, experimental, surreal, and critical. And although it was mostly men that we associate with, such as Alexei Sale, Rick Mayall, Ade Edmondson, Keith Allen, Tony Allen, there were also women comedians, many of whom are still around as household names today. Jo Brand, Pauline Melville, Helen Lederer, Linda Smith, Josie Lawrence, Kit Hollaback, Sandy Toksvig, Dawn French, and Jennifer Saunders. By critical, I mean the humour was self-critical or self-deprecating. The defining feature of this new comedy was that the comedians were making themselves vulnerable. They were laughing at their own perceptions and their own prejudices in their own life. And by doing so, they were inviting the audience to laugh at themselves. And in doing this, it was a way of recognizing and questioning the contradictions in society. And also, the humour wasn't always funny. And in all my talks, I reiterate the importance that humour doesn't necessarily equate with laughter. And what the alternative comedy movement introduced was unexpected, often unpleasant emotions: shock, disgust and sadness, not necessarily laughter. If we argue that self-mockery is okay, then we're agreeing with Sigmund Freud, who in writing about humour looked at the self-mockery in the Jewish joke. Freud argued that the self-mocking joke also includes an element of self-praise. Whilst this may be looking at their faults, it was also highlighting the good qualities. So how does this idea relate to lesbian cartoonists who were gently satirizing stereotypes of the lesbian? And by stereotype, I mean when an entire group of people are reduced to a few character traits, often negatively interpreted. And I'm going to jump over to America for a while, to Alison Bechdel, who is an American cartoonist who shot to fame with her graphic memoir Fun Home in 2006. But it was Dykes to Watch Out For, which was a cartoon strip first appearing in a feminist newspaper that Bechdel was volunteering for. Right, let's read out. I'm going to read out the cartoon. You're right, goodness no, oh no, you're right, goddess knows how much longer it'll last. Doesn't the increasing conservatism in this country worry you? It makes me feel kind of schizophrenic. Here we are going about our little counterculture lives, right? But out there in the real world, they're bombing abortion clinics, holding Nazi and KKK rallies, trying to quarantine people who might have AIDS. They're making secret weapon deals to illegally fund so-called freedom fighters and calling it the Lord's work. We're living in a Protestant police state, and all I'm worried about is getting a job so I can help perpetuate the paranoid, patriarchal death culture. You two are absolutely right. Thanks for the lentils. I have to go home now and rethink my priorities. So off she goes, slam. And her friends say, great, now I'm anxious and depressed. And the other one says, if I weren't so principled, I'd say it's high time she got herself a girlfriend. So the good qualities are clear, even though she's drawing on the stereotype of the lentil-eating, politically concerned lesbian. That's also the good qualities. But the stereotype, which only looks at is reduced to a few characteristics, is what we might call as a two-dimensional character. And what Alison Bechdel introduces here is the everyday contradictions, the everyday concerns of getting a job and falling in love that we all share. And it's this everydayness that brings her comic strip about a community of friends. It challenges what we might call the moral myth of normativity. Which creates a framework reinforcing negative stereotyping. So by challenging the either or, this binary approach, and turning it into both and, the negative stereotypes are corrected through comedy. By challenging the opposites stop. I think also there's another strategy being used here, which is in using and mocking the stereotype. That's related to the idea of reclaiming negative language. And we already see that in Bechdel's titles, Dykes to Watch Out For. So words such as dyke and queer reclaimed words used by the LGBT community. And it's French feminist Luce Irigaray referred to this as jamming the theoretical machinery. She argued that the point was to disrupt the system rather than replace it, and saw language as key to this process. And I suggest that Bechdel's cartoon also visually disrupts by reclaiming the stereotypes of the stereotyping of the lesbian. But why am I talking about American cartoonists? Is Kate Charlesworth Britain's Alison Bechdel? We have our own. And so I looked at Kate's work as an individual, although again, her work is often protesting, and she was part of the collectives. Her background was very different to Alison Bechdel's, in that she successfully always has worked as a graphic designer and illustrator, as well as a cartoonist. But what was similar is that she had created this cartoon strip for the Pink Paper around this community of gay lesbian friends. And in doing that, she again going beyond the stereotype and looking at the everyday, she was creating the community and understanding in the UK, as well as providing social documentation specific to the UK. And this one shows how the lesbian gay community were united in protesting against Clause 28, the local government bill which banned the promotion of homosexuality by local authorities. So here we go. So it's a phone-in radio program. You're listening to today's problem. It's homosexuality this morning, and next we go to Peter. Peter says, look, Nick, homosexuality is only a problem for straight bigots, not for us gays. I'm gay and proud. I'm proud of who I am and what I am, and of my lover Wayne and our relationship, and his friends in the background. A star, a star. Lesbians and gay men are loving human beings who deserve no more and no less rights than anyone else in society. Clause 28 won't send us back into the closet, just the reverse. And his friends are in the background. Yeah, right. He says, we're out and we're staying out. Yay. And the radio person says, well, strong feelings from Peter and friends there. And the last panel, we see Peter off the phone with his friends. You don't think my mother could match up a voice print of that? And so immediately in the last panel, there's this contradiction that he's obviously not out to his mother. And it's this that brings it to the contradictions that we all have, the everyday worries that makes it so successful. All right, so my examples are fairly innocuous, really, of self-mockery. And I think certainly that in the examples I looked at, the use of self-mockery is overall transformative. By using gentle satire, the audience is invited to self-reflect around serious issues. But I wanted to examine this feminist unease a little bit further, because I wanted to question whether self-mockery can justify ideas and behaviors if they're dangerous and offensive. So what I mean specifically is when, oh, I just forgot, I needed to do a product placement for Kate Charlesworth's book, which is Sensible Footwear, which is a fabulous documentation of British LGBT history and Kate positioning herself growing up as well as autobiographical. So it's really an exciting work that's come out. Right, back to my questioning my feminist unease about self-mockery. So what I mean is when we hear, when, for example, people follow up offensive comments with, but it's just a joke, when it's said by someone outside a group to ridicule with these possible dangerous implications. And this seems a great illustration by Christine Roche. I think this line of questioning is relevant because it's important for us to understand how stereotyping can become problematic, and I think it's also really relevant to recent debates around racism in comedy beyond cartooning. One argument put forward by British sociologist Christy Davies is that if stereotypes are presented in jokes, they're not believed because they're too exaggerated, too extreme to take seriously. So, for example, if you take a contribution to anti-Semitism in the form of a joke, Davies argues it's so trivial, it's negligible. He distinguishes between actual anti-Semitism and the playfulness of jokes. But what this idea relies on is a cultural belief or a cultural assumption that hatred is humorless, that hatred is incompatible with humour, and that the bigot is humorless. And this is an idea supported by German philosopher Theodor Adorno's work on authoritarianism, which depicts the bigot as mean-spirited and envying others' enjoyment of life. In other words, the idea is that the real bigot is humorless and is also associated with other negative qualities such as envy. And here I signpost back to my other talks about these negative qualities of envy attributed to the humorless feminist. And here, another Christine Roche cartoon about having no sense of humour. So humour theorist Michael Billig looks at just a joke, this problem, as justifying offensive ideas in his study of extreme racist jokes of the Ku Klux Klan, and he disagrees with Davies. He argues that if we understand a joke as primarily a type of communication, then it has the potential to convey a social and political message, whatever that may be. So we may feel that Michael Billig's examples are very extreme, but again, I return to my starting point in my previous talks about the damaging implications of the persistent stereotyping of the humorless, angry, envious feminist, quietly, persistently damaging and hateful stereotypes disguised by humor. And finally, I wanted to talk about the Greenham Common Peace Camp as my example of protest. And this was, the Peace Camp was developed from protest against the government decision to allow nuclear cruise missiles to be sited at RAF Greenham Common in Berkshire. And the most spectacular feminist protest event within recent British feminist history. In summer '81, A Walk for Life, the gathering of women at Greenham Common mirrored the formation of the women's liberation movement in the 70s, in that the activity was not with any particularly formal structure. It simply began with 40 women and children walking 140 miles to the base. So at first, the Greenham Peace Camp was mixed, and then before it became a women's camp. But women found that men were beginning to run it, so they were asked to leave. And this may appear an example of extreme separatism, but Jackson's comic strip so perfectly identifies and satirizes the subtle positioning of the male. She says, "Frank and I are going to the peace camp. I'm going to picket and Frank's going to make sandwiches in support. Frank says it's really important for women to organise autonomously, but he wants to be around in case there's any trouble. Just finished Frank's sarnies, then I must go and pack for the peace camp. Kaolin and morphine, plastic sheeting, just a few essentials. Franks thinks I should take something symbolic to hang on the fence." And the friend says, "How about Frank?" In 1982, the Embrace the Base event took place, in which the women planned to encircle the 9-mile perimeter of the Greenham Common base with a chain of women holding hands. And they estimated they'd need 8,000 women to do this, and put out a call via feminist chain letters. And this isn't a chain letter, but and it's not a cartoon, but it's one of my favorite images that I came across in my research. And when I saw Annie Lawson, I think, presented it in a presentation, and she said, "Does anyone know what this is?" And I had no idea. So because in our internet age, we're so far removed from the landline, but this was a list of people, and it told you who you had to telephone to convey and spread the information. So it was, but it also looks so lovely to me. It's beautiful. So a really great social documentation of this time. And then I'm going to finish on, again, this self-mockery. So you hold hands for 10 years, then this big cloud of non-violence comes down and suffocates the military. That's the theory anyway. So this delightful cartoon by Ange Stewart Park. And to sum up with my conclusions from this talk, there were contradictions all over the place. And what's so shocking is it's just like now. We've seen the same contradiction between neoliberal priorities and the well-being of society. And certainly in the 80s, cartoons and comics seemed to be a way of commenting, challenging and easing the tensions. And I'm sure they still have a place in politics today. The humour is what I conclude of this decade was often self-deprecating, was being used to challenge and address debate and also consolidate groups. And I think that was an important, again, this time of change. And again, in terms of how comics were being made, the feminist structures, especially within publishing, were widening to the benefit of women cartoonists, and relationships were strengthening to create this foundation for comics and cartoons to be part of this wider feminist cultural production. Thank you very much.